Human beings, throughout the ages, harbor famished souls. The chaotic context in which they find themselves placed is an open invitation to find meaning and fulfill the soul. For the world in which they reside is abundant with temporarily satisfying artifacts of pleasurable worth. The self, as an agent of the soul, bears an appetite that seeks fulfillment in these artifacts, in order to resolve the inner turmoil of feeling dissonant, incomplete, and empty within both external and internal worlds. The scope of these artifacts spans from the simple, such as tangible amenities which satisfy physical desires, to the complex, such as meaning constructs that satisfy existential and spiritual desires. As human progress gave way to more complicated necessities, institutions took up the mantle for sating the appetite of the self. Religion offered consolation to the four existential crises of death, meaning-making, isolation, and responsibility. The solution of faith was sufficient until the world became more empirical. With the introduction of psychoanalysis, religion was left high and dry and under fire. Though some philosophers and psychologists, like William James, Carl Jung, and Nietzsche, postulated a much-needed and reformed modern take on faith, the explanatory power of science and reason became dominant. At this moment, there began an inward clash that questioned the reality of the self. What is it, and how does it function to serve human needs? Sigmund Freud argues that the self is driven by unconscious primitive desires innate to all human beings. These drives, if left unchecked, unresolved, and unconquered, would spiral humanity down the road that leads to corruption and malice. As a result, due to the rise in popularity of psychoanalysis and historically tense global affairs, the government took responsibility to harness and suppress these drives, often for the good of the state at the expense of the less powerful. Neil Postman, in the writing of Amusing Ourselves to Death, keenly noticed that control can be maintained in one of two fashions: Orwellian or Huxleyan. Orwellian government rules out of fear, as George Orwell's acclaimed novel 1984 clearly depicts. Tyranny of this sort subjugates its citizens by forcing utter dependence on higher government, or else calamity ensues. Truth is framed and manufactured to inform the masses of an alternate reality, a reality that artificially fulfills its subjugates. The empty self conforms out of terror and a will to survive. Huxleyan, on the other hand, is the reversal of Orwellian oppression. In reference to Huxley's utopian novel Brave New World, control is assumed by inflicting pleasure and abundance upon the masses rather than terror. The documentary The Century of the Self emphasizes that the sheer quantity of amenities numbs the masses into docile consumers. In this way, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. The advancement of technology has made it so what once was important now becomes a spectacle of entertainment. What is easily shown replaces what is easily thought by the public. The nuances of language get lost in performance, connection gets replaced with fandom, and reality, as the viewer now consumes it, gets contorted within the silver screen. In this way, Huxleyan oppression is that of pleasure and blissful ignorance of the truth, which has now become trivially irrelevant. It is much easier to recognize Orwellian than it is to recognize Huxleyan oppression. The reason for this is simple. Who will resist unending amenities, the eye-catching spectacles, and an abundance of commodities to consume? Resisting Orwellian oppression is apparent. Not one human wishes to be subordinate to a tyrant. However, in resisting the tyranny of fear, we entrap ourselves in the Huxleyan reality of instant gratification, objectification, and egotism to satiate our starving and empty selves. The empty self yearns to be filled by anything, and winds up being filled by everything. The beginning of the 20th century gave rise to the widespread consumptionism, which then oriented the self to be satiated by goods and services to maintain an identity. Philip Cushman writes, in his article Why the Self is Empty, that it is this consumerized identity that the state manipulates to secure an orderly society. Early public relations marketing utilized psychoanalysis to cater to the inner desires of men, women, and children with the development of engineered consent, a strategy perfected by Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. All marketed products carried with them an implied emotional connection to identity, which shifted the market from a needs-based to a desires-based mentality. This way, individuals would perpetually seek fulfillment in new, flashy, and glamorous ways. For instance, in order to pronounce their masculinity in post-war America, a man was pressured to buy suits, cigarettes, and fancy cars. In order for women to accentuate their femininity, they must buy dresses, cooking equipment, and refrain from cigarettes, as it was too unseemly for women to indulge in such a masculine product. These items, for both men and women, carried with them an importance in establishing identity, but also in establishing prestige, signified by social stature. Soon people came to the realization that their identity was more complex, and even in disagreement with how marketing represented their identity. As the humanistic paradigm emerged and shadowed psychodynamic and behavioristic thought with a new and refreshing positive individualistic perspective, fixed identity marketing became obsolete. The appetite of the self became concerned with uniqueness and originality. Business would cater their products to fulfill the new need for self-expression. Politics would also shift as democracy recognizes that the empty self is one that can be filled by anything. What goes in is chosen not by the self, but by the external environment. When filled by institutions, it is no longer democracy, but rather a strange form of tyranny. The self has been seized again. Humanistic positive psychology recognizes that the self is hungry, but this particular paradigm also recognizes that humans possess an incredible ability to seek self-actualization and make meaning. The reality of our society is bleak if we fail to recognize what actually matters. Flourishing, as Martin Seligman describes, is a lifestyle that emphasizes positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning-making, and recognizes positive accomplishment. To take to heart the facets of flourishing requires a rejection of commodified society. It requires seeking out what is life-giving, not what is life-draining. Furthermore, it requires a bold intentionality that cuts through illusions of satisfaction, only to settle on what can truly lead to a life rich with wellness. Life is not meant to be lived in selfish seclusion. It's meant to be lived in an abundance of spirit, with those who matter most, such that any storm can be weathered, and then the day can be celebrated. In conclusion, it is imperative we consider the self as empty, with the propensity to crave fulfillment by any means. Simple or complex, artifacts of fulfillment present themselves eager to be consumed. We must take heed and be cautious of what we consume. Both Cushman and Postman waved the signal flags denouncing the temptations of instant gratification, the disillusion of truth, and hollow means to gangly ends. They evoked the emotion of caution and awareness that our society is saturated with commodities. To consume these goods and services reinforces a reality and an identity that fails to persist over time. The cycle presents itself with the likes of the symbolic, grueling Ouroboros, one that is doomed to perpetually consume itself. To be aware is to seek other means of making meaning, not of what can be gained from others, but what can I give. To be aware is to call into question whether or not we are capable of giving, despite a society, a culture, and a world that wills us to consume. Therefore, the nature of fulfillment is not about receiving, but rather about the willingness to give. From there, much joy can be derived. Thank you. Stay curious.